The night was quiet, broken only by the soft hum of tires gliding over the asphalt. James Carter, a black man, drove alone in his luxury car. He wore a sharp suit and carried himself with confidence, but despite the calm atmosphere, his eyes stayed fixed on the rearview mirror. Old habits, shaped by hard experiences. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed behind him. A police car closed in quickly, and James let out a deep breath before pulling over. The officer, White, stepped out of his vehicle. Tall and rigid, he walked up slowly. His hand rested on the holster of his gun. James watched everything through the side mirror. He already knew where this was going. White stopped by the window and knocked firmly on the glass. James rolled it down. "License and registration," the officer demanded. James calmly grabbed his wallet and handed over the documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" White ignored the question and looked over the documents for a moment before raising his eyes. "Is this car yours?" The officer's tone carried an edge of accusation. James pressed his lips together briefly before answering. "Yes, sir. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "Step out of the car now," the officer barked, his voice sharp and filled with authority. James complied, staying calm. He had been through this before. As he leaned against the car, White started to frisk him, quick and rough. James clenched his fists but took a deep breath to stay in control. "What do you do for a living?" "I work for the government," James replied, keeping his voice steady. "The government? And what kind of job would that be?" White asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. James paused, locking eyes with the officer. Then, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a badge. "I'm an FBI agent, sir." White froze. His eyes darted between the badge and James's face. The tension in the air thickened. "What?" The officer's voice cracked with disbelief. James stood firm, his voice calm and controlled. "Is there a problem, officer?" White took a step back, his confidence visibly shaken. The authority he carried just moments ago began to crumble, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. On that dark road, the world seemed to stand still. James stood firm, but inside, he was fighting a flood of memories. Memories of stops, just like this one, of eyes that judged before they even listened. Officer White tried to hide his surprise, but his hands trembled slightly. He didn't see this coming. He didn't expect the black man he had just pulled over to be someone with more authority than him. And now the tables had turned. But James knew this wasn't just about him. This moment was bigger than what was happening right there. It was about a reality faced by thousands of people every single day. People judged by the color of their skin, the clothes they wear, or the cars they drive. While White was still processing what had just happened, James stayed silent. He knew that silence was often the most powerful weapon, and at that moment, White felt the weight of it. Desperate to regain control, White blurted out, Is this some kind of joke?" James didn't answer right away. He let the officer sit with his doubt for a moment. Then, with calm confidence, James said, "You can check with dispatch, officer. I'm sure they can confirm my identity." White hesitated. He reached for his radio, but his voice cracked. He knew that in just a few minutes the truth would come out. And then, what would happen next? James kept his eyes locked on the officer. There was no anger in his expression, just something deeper, something that said, "I've been through this before, and it won't be the last time." And that's the harsh reality for so many people. Even when you win, the weight of the fight stays with you. But James refused to let it bring him down. He knew that night was just one more battle in a war that was far from over. White's radio crackled softly, but the silence between them was deafening. The officer still held James's documents, but now his hands were shaking. He tried to pull himself together, but there was no hiding his discomfort. And then, more red and blue lights appeared on the horizon. 2 additional patrol cars approached slowly. Other officers had noticed the stop and decided to pull over to provide backup. James watched the cars roll in. His breathing stayed steady, but deep down, he knew how quickly the situation could spiral out of control. He'd seen it happen before. He knew how fast things could escalate. White stepped back and waved to his colleagues, trying to hide his nerves, but James caught it. "Called for backup, officer?" James asked, his voice calm but firm. "I thought you had this under control. Just a precaution," White replied, his tone defensive. The other officers stepped out of their vehicles and approached. Their hands lingered close to their weapons. Even after seeing the badge gleaming in James's hand, they still looked at him like he was a threat. James raised his voice, but his tone remained steady. "Precaution? Can't you see what's happening here?" He paused, his eyes moving from one officer to the next. "I'm a federal agent, and I'm still being treated like a criminal. Because you can't see past my skin, you see a black man in a nice car and assume something's wrong. Is this the system you're protecting?" The officers shifted uncomfortably, but James didn't back down. This time, his voice grew stronger, filled with confidence and authority. "I've spent years protecting this country, putting my life on the line so people like you can feel safe. And what do I get in return? Suspicion, guns ready, hands on the hood. Why? Because I'm black. Silence cut through the air. The officers glanced at each other, then dropped their eyes to the ground. But James wasn't finished. You're not looking at me as a man. You're looking at a stereotype. And that's the real crime here. The prejudice you're carrying around. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. And let me tell you something. I'm not going to stop fighting to change that. James turned his gaze to White and then to the other officers. You need to change. Because today I already changed the game, and this story, it doesn't end here. James turned slowly toward his car, but his mind was far from there. Every step echoed like a reminder of what he had just experienced. He opened the door, but before getting in, he looked back at the officers one last time. And what happens now? He asked, his voice steady, but waited. Are you just going to go back to your lives like nothing happened? Or will you remember this night and start questioning your own actions? The officers remained silent, but that silence said everything. It was the sound of guilt, and James knew it. He started the engine, but before pulling away, he glanced one more time through the rearview mirror. The officers were still standing there, frozen, trapped in their own thoughts. James, inner voice, how can I change this? It's not fair that so many people have to go through this just because of their skin color. I need to find a better way to fight this. As he drove off, the red and blue lights faded into the distance, but the echoes of that night lingered, not just for James, but for everyone involved. At that moment, James knew this battle was far from over, because the fight against prejudice doesn't just happen under bright lights. It happens on dark roads, in moments of silence, and in the courage to stand firm when everything tells you to back down. James's car moved down the empty road, but with each passing mile, the weight of the night pressed heavier on him. The quiet hum of the engine clashed with the noise inside his head, turbulent thoughts and images on repeat. James, inner voice, how many more times, how many more men like me will have to prove they're innocent before they're heard, before they're seen? He took a deep breath, but the air felt heavy. Even far from the scene, the words still echoed. Precaution, misunderstanding, empty phrases used to justify the unjustifiable. James's eyes shifted to the badge sitting on the passenger seat, a symbol of authority, respect, and power. But tonight it hadn't been enough, and that, more than anything, was what hurt the most. James, inner voice, being treated like a threat, even as the man who's supposed to protect. He gripped the steering wheel, feeling the heat of frustration rising inside him. But beneath the anger, there was something stronger. Determination. James, inner voice, this doesn't end here. It can't end here. The headlights cut through the darkness, but James knew his mission went far beyond that road. He couldn't ignore what had happened. He couldn't let this become just another incident. As the car moved forward, James was already planning his next step. He knew he had to use his voice, his position, and his story to keep fighting, because every step forward wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who never had the chance to be heard. James, inner voice, silence can be broken, and I'm going to make sure it is. His car disappeared down the road, but his words lingered, marked, powerful. The morning sun lit up the cold, white walls of the Internal Affairs office. James Carter, still carrying the weight of the previous night's experience, walked through the reception area and was led to the office of Walter Green, the officer responsible for investigating and handling complaints against police misconduct. Walter, a middle-aged white man, stood up slowly as James entered. His eyes, sharp and questioning, scanned James from head to toe before he even said a word. How can I help you? Walter asked formally. James placed his briefcase on the desk and took a seat, keeping his composure. I want to file a formal complaint against the officers involved in a racially discriminatory stop I experienced last night. Walter leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk. Are you sure it was discrimination? Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. James picked up on the defensive tone. It was the same resistance, the same veiled doubt he had faced the night before. He took a deep breath. I know what happened, and I know discrimination when I see it. I want this complaint filed immediately. Walter leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. We'll need to review all the facts before making any serious accusations. Do you have evidence? Witnesses? James leaned in, locking eyes with Walter. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. I am the evidence, and in case you need to know, I'm a federal agent, so I suggest you take this seriously. Walter's eyes widened. The weight of that revelation made him sit up straight. Suddenly, his tone and posture shifted. A federal agent? Oh, of course. Well, we can get this resolved quickly. I'll start the investigation process right away. James kept his eyes locked on Walter, bracing for more resistance, but Walter was already typing on his computer. I'm going to need a full account, every detail, and I want transparency, James demanded. Daily reports on the investigation's progress. I need guarantees that these officers will be held accountable. Walter nodded, reaching for a notepad. Understood, Agent Carter. I'll do what needs to be done. James relaxed his shoulders slightly, but his eyes stayed sharp. I hope so, because this fight isn't just mine. It's for everyone who's been through this and never had a voice. Walter paused his writing and looked up. "I'll make sure you're heard." The scene closed with James leaving the office, this time with a sense that, though the battle was just beginning, he had planted the first seed for change. James's determination to change the system pushed him to act. He contacted his federal superiors and laid out the entire situation. His goal was to push for deeper structural reforms in policing practices to reduce racial and social discrimination, issues that had been widely reported and criticized by the public. His superiors gave him their full support. Days later, James Carter stood before a packed room. Public safety officials, scholars, and human behavior experts had gathered to discuss reforms in the policing system. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with expectation and tension. James stood up and walked to the podium. He knew this moment could be a turning point for real change. James, opening the speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today not just as a federal agent, but as someone who has personally felt the impact of a broken system. A system that judges before it knows, that reacts before it understands." He paused, letting his words sink in as the audience hung on his every word. "And that is why we need change, not just in protocols, but in mindsets. We need to build a police force that respects human dignity, that sees beyond the color of skin and recognizes the worth of every citizen." Murmurs spread across the room. One of the participants, psychologist Dr. Alan Mendez, raised his hand. "James, your experience exposes an uncomfortable truth, but how do we train officers to act with more humanity in high-pressure situations?" James stepped closer. "With education and practice, by working side by side with psychologists, sociologists, and specialists. We'll create simulations, train empathy, and teach emotional control. We'll shape officers to be protectors, not predators." The local police chief, who was also present, stood up. "And how do we make sure this actually works in practice?" Without hesitation, James replied, "With constant monitoring and regular evaluations, but most importantly, with commitment. And the fact that this room is full today proves that the commitment has already begun." The room erupted into applause, but James knew this was just the beginning. In the months that followed, the program led by James started to take shape. Behavioral studies were conducted, psychological training was introduced, and new approaches were tested. The results soon followed: a sharp drop in reports of abuse and a rise in public trust in law enforcement. Walter, the internal affairs officer who initially resisted James's complaint, was among the first to acknowledge the impact. Walter, to James, "You did it, Carter. You turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change." James responds, "We're just getting started, Walter, but thank you for believing." Word spread quickly. The program became an international model, attracting delegations from other countries eager to learn from its success. James, once a victim of prejudice, was now seen as a symbol of justice and transformation. James, inner voice. "A system doesn't change overnight, but once change begins, it becomes unstoppable, and I'll make sure it keeps moving forward." The story of James Carter is more than just one man's fight against racial discrimination. It's a story about courage, resilience, and turning pain into purpose. This narrative exposes an uncomfortable but necessary truth. Prejudice is still deeply rooted in many systems. Fighting it requires effort, education, and bravery. James didn't just resist the injustice he faced. He used his position and experience to drive real change. He confronted institutional resistance and refused to back down. Instead, he led a movement for transformation that gained international recognition. If this story moved you, and you believe in the importance of addressing issues like racism, discrimination, and social justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, we share real, inspiring, and impactful stories like this one. Stories that make us reflect and take action. Leave a like, share this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss new content. Let's keep fighting together for a more just and equal world. See you in the next video.